Hello, folks and college students. Welcome to the second section of comparing Ohio government to the federal government. This is just a more advanced look with more details about what are some of the similarities, what are some of the differences between the Ohio government and the federal government. And so the first thing that we're going to look at, again, the notes for this section are embedded with the video. So if you want to fill these in, feel free to do so. But the first thing we're going to look at is how does Ohio government compare to the national government in terms of fairness to its citizens? How much power does each citizen have in their vote relative to other citizens? And what you're going to find out is actually state governments at this point have more fairness to citizens than the federal government does. So when we're talking about fairness, what are we talking about? We're talking about something called the one person, one vote principle, which means that when you cast a vote, that nobody else's vote is more powerful than your vote, that all of our voices count equally. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you look at the United States Senate, and we've talked about this earlier in the year already, um, it does not have proportional representation. States are not apportioned in the Senate according to their population. Each state is given two senators regardless of population, and each state is given, to a large extent, electoral votes in the presidential election. Um, Not based on its population, but just based on its Senate representation. So if you look at Wyoming, it only has 600 and some thousand people in it, but it has two senators. And if you look at Ohio, it has two senators, but it has 11 million people. So that means in Ohio, each senator represents 5.5 million people. And in Wyoming, each senator represents 330,000 people. So, who has more voice in the United States Senate, a citizen from Wyoming or a citizen from Ohio? Clearly, at one per 330,000 versus 5.5 million, Wyoming has a bigger voice. Now, why do we do that? We do it so that the same states or the same places don't always have the biggest voice in everything that goes on in the United States. The small states would probably fail to participate after a while if you didn't let them have this voice. Now, does the same sort of principle apply to the states? The Supreme Court answered in a case in 1960 called Baker versus Carr. The answer is no. States are not allowed to have certain places within the state have more voice than another. Now, why did they do this? Well, there were a lot of states that had not adjusted their state legislature in 1960 since the Civil War, which ended in 1865, almost 100 years earlier. Why did they not reapportion or readjust? Well, white people tended to live a lot in the rural areas, and African Americans moved to the cities. And so there was an attempt to try and basically water down the vote of African Americans by not reapportioning these legislatures. And so the Supreme Court said every 10 years, state legislatures, you have to reapportion. And they say the same rules that apply to the United States Senate don't apply to states. States, citizens, all have to be equal. Okay, so state governments actually have the opportunity in some ways to be more democratic than the federal does. Um, in terms of what are some of the differences or some of the powers or comparisons of the executive branch. We don't really talk much about the executive branch in the regular curriculum, but governors actually have powers that in some cases exceed their counterpart, which would be the president of the United States and the federal government. So governors, again, are the chief executive of a state. They're the highest official in a state, and in some ways, they do have more powers than even the president of the United States. Number one, they can let somebody out of prison, put them on parole. Um, based on certain conditions. Now, most governors don't do this themselves anymore. They have a parole board that does it. But they also have the power to send accused criminals back to other states to face justice or not, with the power of extradition. Governors have been known to hold up extraditions when they don't like what another state is going to do or is threatening to do to a particular individual in certain circumstances. So that's a power they have. So where do a lot of the powers that governors have and state legislatures have come from? A lot of them come from a time period called the Progressive Era in the United States history. The Gilded Age, which you studied in your class, was from 1880 through 1900, and that's when the power of business was in its heyday, and many powerful individuals were basically running the country. During that same period of time, the Gilded Age, political machines developed as organizations in big cities. And these were basically legal organized crime networks in some ways, where you would have a person in a city called a boss, and the boss basically would give new immigrants into the city jobs in exchange for their votes and for their help in getting votes. And they were very effective at controlling big city governments. Well, this development in the late 1800s did not sit well with the native population that was upset at the immigrants that were involved in this particular circumstance or in political machines. And so they reacted against it. And so the progressive movement was born as both a reaction against the wealth of wealthy businessmen who had a lot of influence and a reaction against big city political machines. And so a lot of people, when they look back in history, they're like, wow, those progressives, they were do-gooders. They were great people. They were concerned about the rights of the regular guy being trampled by the poor. But when you look at the immigrant aspect and the minority aspect of it, they were also nativist, they were racist, they were populist. So with the good came the bad. But the progressives also brought a lot of policies that you see at the state level today, and we call these the tools of direct democracy. Yesterday, you learned about how in Ohio we're allowed to have a voter initiative and a voter referendum. Those are tools of direct democracy that came from the progressive era. So there were lots of legislative and executive branch innovations that came in the progressive era, two of which you know about. One is called the direct initiative, and that's what you learned about yesterday. State of Ohio curriculum terms, we just call that the initiative. But a direct initiative is what that is, and it allows citizens to make up their own laws. Sometimes legislatures, if they're being really wimpy and they don't want to be on the record for casting a vote themselves, some states allow something called an indirect initiative. Ohio is not one of those states, but that's where the legislature can simply take a bill that they have not voted on and turn it over to the people and say, okay, you vote on it. And so you don't have to go around and sign petitions or anything with an indirect initiative. This is the legislature referring a law to the people. You also have the referendum, which we learned about yesterday. That's when the legislature already passes a law. It's been signed by the governor, and the people don't like it. And so they pass around petitions to get rid of that law. That is a referendum. The final piece of direct democracy from the progressive era is called the recall. And this is where citizens are unsatisfied with the job that somebody's doing in government. And as a result, they want to end that person's term early. If you get enough petitions, you can have that official put up to be removed. Right now, Gavin Newsom is being threatened with recall. He's the governor of California. Probably 10, 15 years ago, a governor named Gray Davis in California was recalled, and they replaced him with, guess who? Arnold Schwarzenegger. So Sometimes recalls are good, sometimes they're bad. Usually they fail, but citizens can do that. Um, the other, and it's the big one, and we have this in Ohio, that's a reform of the progressive era for the executive branch, is the line item veto. What this allows the governor to do is to get rid of portions of a bill that they find objectionable or just take a line that's written in it out of it. Okay. Now in Ohio, the governor's line item veto is only for budget lines. So the governor can't take a line out of a bill that, say, establishes a bus line or a railroad line. They can't take portions out of that that they don't like. They can just take things that might be spent on that railroad or bus line. They can take those out, but they can't take the lines out of the part establishing those. Okay, now other states are different. They give their governor more power with their line item veto. One of those states that up until 2 years ago did that was Wisconsin. And they had this governor named Tommy Thompson in the late 1990s that used his line item veto to take the word no or take the word will do out of something to basically make bills have the intent which was opposite what the legislature intended. And so they had to pass a law called the Vanna White Amendment that limited the power of Governor Thompson to do this because they were tired of their bills being reversed. So the line item veto is different in different states because we have this federal system that allows differences that no American seems to know about or appreciate, and hopefully you will when you leave this class. But it's different. But a line item veto lets the governor take a line out of a bill they don't like. You also had reforms not of just the legislative branch in terms of the people legislative, not just the executive branch in terms of the line item veto and the recall, but you also had reforms of the judicial branch. And mainly, this corrects the problems that I address in the video about this contradiction in should we elect judges or should we have them appointed? Each one of those systems has certain strengths and weaknesses that I noted. If you elect judges, it allows the people to have control over the decisions that our judges are making, which has strengths and weaknesses in of itself. Sometimes judges have to make unpopular decisions based on people's rights. And so having them subject to election can make them fearful of doing so. So it might take away some of their independence, but it does allow them to be held accountable to the people. The problem is the people have no idea who the judges are. And so they go out and they vote strictly on party lines these days. In Hamilton County, where Cincinnati is, they threw out tons of Republican judges a couple years ago because they were doing a bad job. No, because they were Republicans. And you know, you can say what you will about that, but basically, that's probably not a good reason to deny a person a job being a judge. And so you also have appointing people. That's what we do with federal judges, where the president chooses them and then they're confirmed by the Senate. They do get independence, but also they can make some decisions where people are just like, what are you thinking with particular decisions? And they have no accountability. So in Missouri, they came up with something called the merit plan. And that is a happy medium between letting the people select judges and letting them be appointed. What it does is it creates a list that is put together by an independent panel of voters that are like, all these people in the state are qualified to be judges. That list is then given to the governor. And anytime there's a judicial vacancy and they need a judge, the governor of that state that has this Missouri or merit plan chooses a judge off of the list. Then, after a certain term, and it's going to vary based on states that have this plan, because again, we have this magical thing called federalism that lets us have different types of government in different states. the people after a certain amount of term can vote yes or no on that judge, and most are just simply voted back in. And that also can take the party out of it, because then people would have to say, well, you got to vote this person out based on what? They would have to come up with some kind of decision they made that they shouldn't have liked, or things like that. And so most of them are voted back in unless they do something egregious where the people are like, you're not coming back. And then a governor will just choose a new one off the list. So it's kind of a happy medium to keep people from voting on things that they have no idea what they're doing. All right. So those are all the reforms of the progressive era, and things you need to know about for this section.